So I think this will be the, other than whatever we end up doing on Monday and Tuesday, this will be the last talk that I'm giving before the election. I've been hearing from people in the UK just how stressed they are about it. So sort of like COVID, it's a worldwide anxiety-producing occasion, I think. I actually have not really prepared a talk about the election. I think from the perspective of the Mahayana, it's so clear that the great work is the reduction of suffering and perhaps the end of suffering. That was what Buddha saw as a real possibility, I believe. And, whatever happens on election night, that work will go on. It can't not. It's true that we would much rather see leaders who understand the causes of suffering, are more aligned with the ending of suffering. We would much rather have that. But the grand, great project of Mahayana, of the great vehicle, will be going on regardless. I promise you. I want to read a poem, actually, to begin tonight. It's another poem by this old friend of mine, Sam Willits, a little one. And it speaks to, I think, in a way, to what I've just been saying, in all different levels. Garden. Look to your life. Rest your kindness and your unkindnesses now and listen. I know what makes your heart clench coldly in all weathers. I know how it feels that it always will. Bear that. Look to your life, to your one given garden. So we had this retreat recently that was basically on the topic of Samadhi, of mindfulness developing into Samadhi. Samadhi being unification of mind, sometimes translated that way. Finding this wondrous clarity and harmony of mind. Really, we might say mind and heart, that is not dependent on any outside input or assistance. It's a condition, state, quality, fact of mind. It's consciousness itself finding its way, having found its way to settle into a deep, alive peace that doesn't need anything to exist that way. It's a kind of a cause-free, condition-free state of consciousness. I mean, it has causes to get there, but it itself doesn't have. So we have to do all kinds of stuff, apparently, to find that intrinsic condition of non-suffering. There's a fact of consciousness. It's great and it's wonderful, and we're blessed to be creatures that can find that and taste that. It's not yet awakening. It still has a meditator who's having the experience, but that's not to knock it, not at all. But at the same time, I want to just remind us that it's not like things only start to be good in practice when you hit things like that. Not at all. Our initial and ongoing practice of developing mindful awareness, I just want to make sure that we're not forgetting about that in the aftermath of that retreat. And I have a few words here I want to say about mindfulness. A perspective on it, a view of it, that it's like developing mindfulness. Here's a way of looking at it, that it's like creating a warm, loving home inside yourself. Whenever an uncomfortable feeling, what did Sam say? A chilly clench of the heart. He's quite a wordsmith, as you can tell. He said, yeah, I know what makes your heart clench coldly. Clench coldly. So mindfulness being like creating a warm, loving home inside yourself. Whenever an uncomfortable feeling, an edge of fear, sadness, anxiety, stress, sense of rush, urgency, overwhelm, or despondency arises in the heart, or body or mind, the warm home is there waiting for it, to welcome it and give it a warm embrace. The warmth of the welcome is stronger than the chill of the distress. It's very nice to have this kind of home inside oneself. And it needn't take a whole lot of practice to develop it. There may be various waifs and strays, street kids, lost urchins, and orphans who show up, feeling bad and needing a home. And to have that capacity, that warmth of a hearth, of a well-beloved and loving household, of a loving family that can take them in, makes a huge difference for nearly all of us, I would think. That's a taste of mindfulness developing and expanding its capaciousness when we feel that. Okay, so please don't feel that exalted states like Samadhi are where the good stuff begins. Not so. But it's also true that in Samadhi, when we find that it's possible to be deeply at peace, in a quiet bliss, without any outside help, that is also an important development. in practice. But what about after that? Just a little sort of a glimpse looking ahead to the next retreat, number 4 in the sequence, rather than just the meditator experiencing that, we are, after all, a Zen lineage here, a Zen koan lineage at that takes very seriously this great matter of Mahayana awakening, which means, in a nutshell, discovering nothing is separate from anything else. Not because there's lots of links, but because there's a single tissue. I think that word came up beautifully from Valerie in the last retreat. There's a single tissue, which is all things. And it's right here now. It is the very fabric of your own consciousness. Because your consciousness is actually the consciousness of all things. So right here now, we've been accustomed to thinking of ourselves as a solitary raindrop coming down a window pane. One raindrop. And there's lots of raindrops, but we are that one coming down the window pane. I grew up in a rainy country, so this is a familiar sight. Watching raindrops coming down a window was a pastime in Britain when I was a kid, and you'd see sometimes 2 drops would get nearer and nearer, and then nearer and nearer, and suddenly, instead of being 2, they'd sort of zip together and become one large drop. That's exactly parallel to what happens in Kensho. We're sitting, we're working with Mu. We're one raindrop, Mu is another raindrop. It's just set up like that in our minds, and you can't see it any other way. It's so clear that I am this, what's the word? Defined, delineated consciousness. And I can think about this thing, Mu. It's an object. I'm the subject. Mu is the object. One raindrop, another raindrop. And actually, all the time, every time we do Mu in our sit, Mu, Mu, we don't know it, but these 2 raindrops are getting just a smidgen closer. Mu, Mu, Mu. Subject and object, secretly, surreptitiously, in a hidden way, getting just a teeniest, tiniest, I don't know what they call them, micrometer, like, I don't know the words, but much smaller than a millimeter, way, way, way smaller than a millimeter, just a tiny bit closer. We don't know it, but every time we do Mu in our sitting, those of you working with Mu, every time there's another Mu, just a smidgen of distance is shaved off the gap between this raindrop and that raindrop. Mu. The 2 are getting tiny. At some point, we don't know when, suddenly, they're just close enough that the surface tension that holds each drop apart from the other, by some little sort of miracle, that surface tension vanishes. And the clearly 2 things that it seemed like they could never not be 2 things, by themselves, the last molecule that was maintaining their separation vanishes, and they're one. And that's how Mu practice works. That's my analogy for tonight, okay? And so Samadhi, it doesn't make that happen, but it's a good context for that process. It's like I remember in a recent talk, Valerie talked about being in a womb, or a practitioner being in a womb of Joshu or something like that. Well, Samadhi is the womb where, actually, I've just thought of another way we could play this analogy. If we're talking about wombs, it could be ovum and spermatozoa. how they unite. Sorry. That wasn't quite, let's cut the womb thing out of it. Raindrops on a window pane. Okay. So that's let me just see. Sorry, is that ding ding ding? Yeah. Okay. So that's what I wanted to say about the place of samadhi, the importance, nevertheless, of mindfulness, and how healing and helpful that can be. And thirdly, the possibility of practice as the context in which we make this. The thing is, if you hear it described, Henry says, everything, you become one with Mu, or two raindrops become one. It doesn't sound such a big deal, but it's a huge deal, because when you become one with something else, you at the same instant, you discover that something else and you are both one with everything. So you can't do it in a sort of, just me and it kind of way. It's like at the instant of becoming one with something, both you and it are dropping into the level where you're one with everything. You see what I mean? It's like it's a shift in level, that you stop being this contracted consciousness that takes itself out of that level of consciousness. Now, this might sound all fanciful and it's weird, but actually there's science these days, quite real. They call it panenpsychism. Books are being written about it. This real possibility that essentially everything is conscious. Everything is a field of consciousness. And one of the problems that view had posed to philosophers was, well, then, for example, you could say, if everything's consciousness, then how do you get, they call it the combination problem. Like, how do you get lots of pieces of this consciousness to become a whole? Like, if every component of a worm is conscious, how does the worm get its own coherent consciousness? If every piece of you or I, 7 trillion or whatever it is, bits of consciousness in each cell or whatever, how do you get to there being a consciousness that is whole for this particular creature? And they've figured out it can work. Actually, they call it they say there's different levels of consciousness. Like, okay, I'm not going to get into too much depth of this, but do you see that actually it can work? It can work. They figured out this model, this way of thinking about it can work, that there's simply different levels, sort of hierarchies of consciousness, that all these things combined, they make a certain kind of consciousness, but that little bit over there is also a combination of stuff. That's got its kind too. That's got its kind too. But this discovery of Mahayana Buddhism, of reality as one, is getting to the level where none of those separatenesses are apparently arising. Okay. So I hope I just made it clear why meeting Mu in that kind of way is a very big deal. It's not just about you and Mu. It's only when you meet Mu like that that you find out what Mu actually is and what you actually are. And it pertains to everything. Okay, I think I've said enough on that. So now what I want to do at this point is just read to you actually from the priest that I quoted about a month ago, who has been working down in Juarez with immigrant families, and a very nice further piece that she's shared with me from the book she's writing, which is called "The Problem of Self in the Face of the Suffering of Others." And I hope that, we can take this as, just a reminder, really, of the scale of problems that people in our world are facing, and of the fact that, this kind of work, addressing suffering, doing these many ways that we're engaged in of trying to reduce suffering, this is it's a big project, and it's going on and on. It's going to be going on. So here's this passage. Someone should write an article called "The Problem of Self in the Face of the Suffering of Others." I'm serious. So often, people's suffering is only the start of the problem. The rest is created by our responses to that suffering, which multiply rather than reduce its effects. It is everywhere, the effects of this problem, in me most of all. This is, by the way, she's called Christina Rathbone, Reverend Christina, okay. Patience, patience, I tell myself, and hush, hush, dare not to speak, not to do, not to try to fix. I'm not very good at it, but I'm learning, and to help me, examples are everywhere. The American priest who meets his first asylum seeker, again, this is down in Juarez on the border with the US, and is able to listen to the elderly woman's anguish for just a minute and a half before straightening up and taking control, advising and recommending and directing the woman who has spent 3 months on the road already and almost 6 weeks more right here, as if he is the one who knows. Or the person who cooks a mountain of chicken for the community on the street, but who then, out of fear or thoughtlessness or shyness, who knows, leaves it all on the corner in a see-through plastic bag with only the word pollo, chicken, written on a note card taped to the top, which leads in the end to a wrenching but unanimous decision to throw it all away because who wants to risk it, and to the tears of multiple kids who wanted to eat it anyway. Sometimes, though, panicked responses to real powerlessness in the face of the suffering of others can reap real harm. Just today, a young man set up a table under a rainbow striped beach umbrella on the corner of the street by the bus stop. He has a shiny red battery operated megaphone, and through this, he announces he is here to help. He has forms required by the US for the asylum process, he says. They're in English, but he will translate them and then help folks fill them in. Take a form, he says, handing them out. Take a form. And by the time I arrive, a long line extends down the block and people are nervous. The lawyer from Clinic, CLINIC, that's a legal aid operation. The lawyer from Clinic, Tanya Guerrero, has been visiting every week for a couple of months now. She holds legal charlas, chats, right there on the sidewalk, informing people about the basics of the asylum-seeking process, preparing them for what might come next. She's knowledgeable, clear, and committed, and she has never mentioned these forms. So, worried a bit, I introduced myself to the young man, who's now all set up at his table, and asked if he is a lawyer. No, I'm not a lawyer, he said. Oh, I respond, do you work with lawyers? I do not, he replies. I don't have to. I looked up what is required on the internet. These forms are completely legitimate. Look, it says right here, application for asylum and for withholding of removal. Why is no one helping them? He interrupts himself to ask. And why are they stuck out here on the street? It's just not okay that they're not allowed to go to a shelter. We beg folks to go to a shelter all the time, I try to explain, but he's too disgusted to hear. I call Tanya, I fill her in, then I hold my phone up to the megaphone mic so she can speak to the community directly. Listen to me, she says, do not fill out these papers. They are real forms and they come from the US, this is true, but they're for later in the process, for after, not before the credible fear interviews you will be facing when you cross. Do not fill them out now. Doing so can do you real harm. False claims of expertise are not new on the street. Last week, a man claiming to be an immigration expert distributed pages he said revealed new asylum policies. The pages were topped with copies of the official ICE insignia and were full of random excerpts from obscure study papers. But because it was all in English, the package looked official enough, and several people were considering paying the 1,000 pesos he asked for it. I translated it during the afternoon meeting, and everyone realized it was garbage and moved on with the kind of unsurprised stoicism I saw again now. Disappointed but resigned, they returned the empty forms to the young man, leaving them in neat piles on his table. One or two stayed, though, and the young man continued to work with them even then, offering his misguided assistance, not because he's bad, but because he is good. He is good and he is tender, and he simply cannot handle seeing so much pain and real suffering in others. And he is me, of course, this young man with his hair pulled into a knot and his beach umbrella and his shiny megaphone and his desire to do good, in a perfect caricature of the me who screams silently away all day that I need to do something and take control and get things done and fix all this. But there is another me too, one who insists more quietly, but also more deeply, that my work is essentially anti-dramatic and so also often anti-gratifying. The opposite of the grand gesture, it takes time and restraint and poverty, and must be, in the end, birthed by desire to learn, not to teach, to become, not to shape, to love unconditionally and endlessly, because I am also loved unconditionally and endlessly. And this, as I keep saying, largely involves frustration and grief and a seemingly endless repetition of tiny, finite, pointless seeming tasks, and always, always a reflection back to others of their own beauty and strength and power, instead of projecting my imaginary own onto them. Sages have had plenty to say about all of this, of course. Even General Mattis, of all people. Browsing a profile of him in the Atlantic this evening, I discovered this astonishing summary of George Washington's leadership style. Washington's idea of leadership, Mattis said, was that first you listen, then you learn, then you help, and only then do you lead. It's a somewhat boring progression, but it's useful. So, first listen, then learn, then help. The real help, she says, must be birthed by desire to learn, not to teach, to become, not to shape, to love unconditionally and endlessly, because I am also loved unconditionally and endlessly. What a beautiful statement, actually, of the very same Mahayana reality that we're sharing, discovering, always being in complete awe of in this practice. So let's not forget, in the midst of our very understandable anxieties about next week, we are practitioners as well. Let's remember, unconditionally and endlessly loved. Not that we don't, do all we can and encourage everybody we know to vote, and, if they haven't already, and so on. Not that we pretend it doesn't matter. That's not quite right either. But not forgetting this context, this boundless, literally endless context. That's so great, it's somehow not even right to call it a context. It doesn't really catch what it's like when we find it. Okay, thank you. And hoping for the best.